Hello again, everyone. It's been about 3 months since I last uploaded, but I'm coming back again with another story time. This time, I will be the narrator, and I'm going to be reading An Ordinary Day with Peanuts by Shirley Jackson. The speed paint you're going to be watching is going to be my attempt at Art Nouveau, and also a kind of tarot card of the moon. I'm not entirely sure if it fits, but that was kind of the vibe I was going for. I really hope you like these videos, because I really like short fiction. Alright. Mr. John Philip Johnson shut his front door behind him and came down the front steps into the bright morning with a feeling that all was well with the world on this best of all days. And wasn't the sun warm and good, and didn't his shoes feel comfortable after the resoling? And he knew he had undoubtedly chosen the precise very tie which belonged with this day and the sun and his comfortable feet, and after all, wasn't the world just a wonderful place? In spite of the fact that he was a small man, and the tie was perhaps a shade vivid, Mr. Johnson irradiated this feeling of well-being as he came down the steps onto the dirty sidewalk. And he smiled at the people who passed him, and some of them even smiled back. He stopped at a newsstand on the corner and bought his paper, saying, "Good morning," with a very real conviction to the man who sold him the paper, and the 2 or 3 other people who were lucky enough to be buying their papers when Mr. Johnson skipped up. He remembered to fill his pockets with candy and peanuts and then set off to get himself uptown. He stopped in a flower shop and bought a carnation for his buttonhole, and stopped almost immediately afterwards to give the carnation to a small child in a carriage, who looked at him dumbly and then smiled, and Mr. Johnson smiled, and the child's mother looked at Mr. Johnson for a minute and then smiled too. When he had gone several blocks uptown, Mr. Johnson cut across the avenue and went along the side street, chosen at random. He did not follow the same route every morning, but preferred to pursue his eventful way in wide detours, more like a puppy than a man intent upon business. It happened this morning that halfway down the block a moving van was parked, and the furniture from an upstairs apartment stood half on the sidewalk, half on the steps, while an amused group of people loitered, examining the scratches on tables and the worn spots on the chairs, and a harassed woman, trying to watch a young child and the movers and the furniture all at the same time, gave the clear impression of endeavoring to shelter her private life to the people staring at her belongings. Mr. Johnson stopped, and for a moment joined the crowd, and then he came forward, and touching his hat civilly, said, "Perhaps I can keep an eye on your little boy for you." The woman turned and glared at him distrustfully, and Mr. Johnson added hastily, "Well, sit right here on the steps." He beckoned to the little boy, who hesitated and then responded agreeably to Mr. Johnson's genial smile. Mr. Johnson brought out a handful of peanuts from his pocket and sat on the steps with the boy, who at first refused the peanuts on the grounds that his mother did not allow him to accept food from strangers. Mr. Johnson said that probably his mother had not intended peanuts to be included, since elephants at the circus ate them, and the boy considered, and then agreed solemnly. They sat on the steps together, cracking peanuts in a camaraderie fashion, and Mr. Johnson said, "So you're moving?" "Yep," said the boy. "Where are you going?" "Vermont." "Nice place. Plenty of snow there. Maple sugar, too. You like maple sugar?" "Sure." "Plenty of maple sugar in Vermont. You're going to live on the farm?" "Going to live with Grandpa." "Grandpa like peanuts?" "Sure." "Ought to take him some," said Mr. Johnson, reaching into his pocket. "Just you and Mommy going?" "Yep." "Tell you what. You take some peanuts to eat on the train." The boy's mother, after glancing at them frequently, had seemingly decided that Mr. Johnson was trustworthy, because she had devoted herself wholeheartedly to seeing that the movers did not, what movers rarely do, but every housewife believes they will, crack a leg from her good table, or set a kitchen chair down on a lamp. Most of the furniture was loaded by now, and she was deep in that nervous stage when she knew there was something she had forgotten to pack, hidden away in the back of a closet somewhere, or left at a neighbor's and forgotten, or on the clothesline and was trying to remember under stress of what it was. "This all, lady?" the chief mover said, completing her dismay. Uncertainly, she nodded. "Want to go on the truck with the furniture, Sonny?" the mover asked the boy and laughed. The boy laughed too, and said to Mr. Johnson, "I guess I'll have a good time in Vermont." "Fine time," said Mr. Johnson, and stood up. "Have one more peanut before you go," he said to the boy. The boy's mother said to Mr. Johnson, "Thank you so much. It was a great help."
"Nothing at all," said Mr. Johnson gallantly. "Where in Vermont are you going?"
The mother looked at the little boy accusingly, as though he had given away a secret of some importance, and said, unwillingly, "Greenwich."
"Lovely town,"
said Mr. Johnson. He took out a card and wrote a name on the back.
"Very good friend of mine lives in Goodwich," he said. "Call on him for anything you need. His wife makes the best doughnuts in town,"
he added soberly to the little boy. "Swell," said the little boy.
"Goodbye," said Mr. Johnson.
He went on, stepping happily with his new-shod feet, feeling the warm sun on his back and on the top of his head. Halfway down the block he met a stray dog and fed him a peanut. At the corner, where another wide avenue faced him, Mr. Johnson decided to go on uptown again. Moving with comparative laziness, he was passed on either side by people hurrying and frowning, and people brushed past him going the other way. Mr. Johnson stopped on every corner and waiting patiently for the light to change, and he stepped out of the way of anyone who seemed to be in any particular hurry. But one young lady came too fast for him, and crashed wildly into him when he stooped to pat a kitten which had run out onto the sidewalk from an apartment house and was now unable to get back through the rushing feet. "Excuse me," said the young lady, trying frantically to pick up Mr. Johnson and hurry on at the same time. "Terribly sorry." The kitten, regardless now of danger, raced back to its home.
"Perfectly all right,"
said Mr. Johnson, adjusting himself carefully.
"You seem to be in a hurry."
"Of course I'm in a hurry," said the young lady. "I'm late." She was extremely cross, and the frown between her eyes seemed well on its way to becoming permanent. She had obviously awakened a little late, because she had not spent any extra time on making herself look pretty, and her dress was plain and unadorned with a collar or brooch, and her lipstick was noticeably crooked. She tried to brush past Mr. Johnson, but risking her suspicious displeasure, he took her arm and said, "Please, wait." "Look," she said ominously, "I ran into you, and your lawyer can see my lawyer, and I will gladly pay all damages and all inconveniences suffered therefrom. But please, this minute, let me go. I am late."
"Late for what?"
said Mr. Johnson. He tried a winning smile on her, but it did no more than keep her, he suspected, from knocking him down again. "Late for work," she said between her teeth. "Late for my employment. I have a job, and if I am late, I lose exactly as much an hour, and I cannot really afford what your pleasant conversation is costing me, be it ever so pleasant."
"I'll pay for it,"
said Mr. Johnson. Now these magic words, not necessarily because they were true or because she seriously expected Mr. Johnson to pay for anything, but because Mr. Johnson's flat statement, obviously innocent of irony, could not be, coming from Mr. Johnson, anything but the statement of a responsible and truthful and respectful man. "What do you mean?" she asked.
"I said that since I am obviously responsible for your being late, I shall certainly pay for it."
"Don't be silly," she said, and for the first time her frown disappeared. "I wouldn't expect you to pay for anything. A few moments ago I was offering to pay you. Anyway," she added, almost smiling, "it was my fault."
"What happens if you don't go to work?"
She stared. "I don't get paid."
"Precisely,"
said Mr. Johnson. "What do you mean precisely? If I don't show up at work exactly 20 minutes ago, I lose $1.20 an hour, or 2 cents a minute on," she thought, "almost a dime for the time I've spent talking to you." Mr. Johnson laughed, and finally she laughed too.
"You're late already," he pointed out. "Will you give me another 4 cents worth?"
"I don't understand why."
"You'll see,"
Mr. Johnson promised. He led her over to the side of the walk, next to the buildings, and said,
"Stand here,"
and went out into the rush of people going both ways. Selecting and considering, as one who must make a choice involving perhaps whole years of lives, he estimated the people going by. Once he almost moved, and then at the last minute thought better of it and drew back. Finally, from half a block away, he saw what he wanted, and moved into the center of traffic to intercept a young man who was hurrying and dressed as though he had awakened late and frowning. "Oof," said the young man, because Mr. Johnson had thought of no better way to intercept anyone than the one the young woman had unwittingly used upon him. "Where do you think you're going?" the young man demanded from the sidewalk.
I want to speak with you,
said Mr. Johnson ominously. The young man got up nervously, dusting himself off and eyeing Mr. Johnson.
What for?
He said. What did I do?
That's what bothers me most about people nowadays,
Mr. Johnson complained broadly to the people passing.
No matter whether or not they've done anything or not, they always figure someone's after them. About what you're going to do,
he told the young man. Listen, said the young man, trying to brush past him. I'm late, and I don't have any time to listen. Here's a dime. Now get going.
Thank you,
Mr. Johnson said, pocketing the dime.
Look, he said, what happens if you stop running?
I'm late, said the young man, still trying to get past Mr. Johnson, who was unexpectedly clinging.
How much do you make an hour?
Mr. Johnson demanded. A communist, are you? Said the young man. Now, will you please let me...
No,
said Mr. Johnson insistently.
How much?
$1.50, said the young man. And now, will you...
You like adventure?
The young man stared, and, staring, found himself caught and held by Mr. Johnson's genial smile. He almost smiled back, then repressed it and made an effort to tear away. I got to hurry, he said.
Mystery? Like surprises? Unusual and exciting events?
You're selling something.
Sure,
said Mr. Johnson.
You want to take a chance?
The young man hesitated, looking longingly up the avenue toward what might have been his destination, and then, when Mr. Johnson said,
I'll pay you for it,
with his own peculiar, convincing emphasis, turned and said, Well, okay. I got to see it first, what I'm buying. Mr. Johnson, breathing hard, led the young man to the side where the girl was standing. She had been watching with interest Mr. Johnson's capture of the young man, and now, smiling timidly, she looked at Mr. Johnson as though prepared to be surprised at nothing. Mr. Johnson reached into his pocket and took out his wallet.
Here,
he said, and handed a bill to the girl.
This about equals your day's pay.
But no, she said, surprised despite herself. I mean, I couldn't.
Please don't interrupt,
Mr. Johnson told her.
And here,
he said to the young man,
this will take care of you.
The young man accepted the bills dazedly, but said, probably counterfeit, to the young woman out of the side of his mouth.
Now,
Mr. Johnson went on, disregarding the young man.
What is your name, miss?
Kent, she said helplessly. Mildred Kent.
Fine, said Mr. Johnson. And you, sir?
Arthur Adams, the young man said stiffly.
Splendid,
said Mr. Johnson.
Now, Miss Kent, I would like you to meet Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams, Miss Kent.
Miss Kent stared, wet her lips nervously, and made a gesture as though she might run, saying, How do you do? Mr. Adams straightened his shoulders, scowled at Mr. Johnson, made a gesture as though he might run, and said, How do you do?
Now this,
said Mr. Johnson, taking out several bills from his wallet,
should be enough for the day for both of you. I would suggest, perhaps, Coney Island, although I'm personally not fond of the place. Or perhaps a nice lunch somewhere, and dancing, or a matinee, or even a movie. Although, take care to choose a really good one. There are so many bad movies these days. You might,
he said, struck by inspiration,
visit the Bronx Zoo or the planetarium. Anywhere, as a matter of fact,
he concluded,
that you would like to go. Have a nice time.
As he started to move away, Arthur Adams, breaking from his dumbfounded stare, said, But see here, mister, you can't do this. Why, how do you know? I mean, we don't even know. I mean, how do you know we won't just take the money and not do what you said?
You've taken the money,
said Mr. Johnson.
You don't have to follow any of my suggestions. You may know something you prefer to do, perhaps a museum or something.
But suppose I run away with it and leave her here?
I know you won't,
said Mr. Johnson gently,
because you remembered to ask me that. Goodbye,
he added, and went on. As he stepped up the street, conscious of the sun on his back and his good shoes, he heard from somewhere behind him the young man saying,
Look, you don't have to if you don't want to,
and the girl saying, "But unless you don't want to." Mr. Johnson smiled to himself, and then thought he had better hurry along. When he wanted, he could move very quickly, and before the young woman had gotten around to saying, "Well, I will, if you will," Mr. Johnson was several blocks away and had already stopped twice, once to help a lady lift several large packages into a taxi, and once to hand a peanut to a seagull. But this time he was in an area of large stores and many more people, and he was buffeted constantly from either side by people hurrying across and late and sullen. Once he had offered a peanut to a man who asked him for a dime, and once he offered a peanut to a bus driver who had stopped his bus at an intersection and had opened the window next to his seat and put out his head as though longing for the fresh air and the comparative quiet of the traffic. The man wanting a dime took the peanut because Mr. Johnson had wrapped a dollar bill around it, and the bus driver took the peanut and asked ironically, "You want a transfer, Jack?" On a busy corner, Mr. Johnson encountered two young people. For 1 minute, he thought they might be Mildred Kent and Arthur Adams, who were eagerly scanning a newspaper, their backs pressed against the storefront to avoid people passing, their heads bent together. Mr. Johnson, whose curiosity was insatiable, leaned onto the storefront next to them and peeked over the man's shoulder. They were scanning "Apartments Vacant" columns. Mr. Johnson remembered the street where the woman and her little boy were going to Vermont and tapped the man on the shoulder and said amiably, "Try down on West 17, about a middle of the block. People moved out this morning." "Say, what do you—" said the man, and then, seeing Mr. Johnson clearly, "Well, thanks. Where did you say?" "West 17, said Mr. Johnson, "about the middle of the block." He smiled again and said, "Good luck." "Thanks," said the man. "Thanks," said the girl, and they moved on. "Goodbye," said Mr. Johnson. He lunched alone in a pleasant restaurant, where the food was rich and only Mr. Johnson's excellent digestion could encompass 2 of their whipped cream and chocolate rum cake pastries for dessert. He had 3 cups of coffee, tipped the waiter largely, and went out onto the street again into the wonderful sunlight, his shoes still comfortable and fresh on his feet. Outside, he found a beggar staring into the windows at the restaurant he had left, and, carefully looking through the money in his pocket, Mr. Johnson approached the beggar and pressed some coins and a couple of bills into his hand. "It's the price of the veal cutlet lunch plus tip," said Mr. Johnson. "Goodbye." After his lunch, he rested. He walked into the nearest park and fed peanuts to pigeons. It was late afternoon by the time he was ready to start back downtown, and he had refereed 2 checkers games and watched a small boy and girl whose mother had fallen asleep and awakened with surprise and fear, which turned into amusement when she saw Mr. Johnson. He had given away almost all of his candy and had fed all of the rest of his peanuts to the pigeons. It was time to go home. Although the late afternoon sun was pleasant and his shoes were still entirely comfortable, he decided to take a taxi downtown. He had a difficult time catching a taxi, because he gave up the first 3 or 4 empty ones to people who seemed to need him more. Finally, however, he stood alone on the corner and, almost like netting a frisky fish, he hailed desperately until he succeeded in catching a cab, which had been proceeded with haste uptown and seemed to draw in towards Mr. Johnson against its own will. "Mister," said the cab driver as Mr. Johnson climbed in, "I figured you was an omen. I wasn't going to pick you up at all." "Kind of you," said Mr. Johnson ambiguously. "If I'd let you go, it would have cost me $10, said the driver. "Really?" said Mr. Johnson. "Yeah," said the driver. "Guy just got out of the cab, gave me $10, and said, 'Take this and bet it in a hurry on the horse named Vulcan, right away.'" "Vulcan?" said Mr. Johnson, horrified. "A fire sign on a Wednesday?" "What?" said the driver. "Anyway, I said to myself, if I got no fare between here and there, I'll bet the 10. But if anyone who looked like they needed a cab, I'd take it as an omen, and I would take the 10 home to the wife." "You were very right," said Mr. Johnson heartily. "This is Wednesday. You would have lost your money. Monday, yes, or even Saturday. But never, never, never fire sign on a Wednesday. Sunday would have been good." "Vulcan don't run on Sunday," said the driver. "You wait till another day," said Mr. Johnson. "Down this street, please, driver. I'll get off the next corner." "He told me Vulcan, though," said the driver. "I'll tell you," said Mr. Johnson. hesitating with the door of the cab half open.
"You take that $10 and I'll give you another $10 to go with it. And you go right ahead and bet that money on any Thursday or any horse, with the name indicating, let me see, Thursday. Well, grain. Or any other growing foods."
"Grain," said the driver. "You mean a horse named, like, Wheat or something?"
"Certainly,"
said Mr. Johnson.
"Or, as a matter of fact, to make it even easier, any horse whose names indicate the letters C, R, or L. Perfectly simple."
"Tall corn?" said the driver, a light in his eyes. "You mean a horse named, like, Tall Corn?"
"Absolutely," said Mr. Johnson. "Here's your money."
Tall corn, said the driver. "Thank you, mister."
"Goodbye,"
said Mr. Johnson. He was on his own corner and went straight up to his apartment. He let himself in and called, "Hello," and Mrs. Johnson answered from the kitchen. "Hello, dear. Aren't you early?"
"Took a taxi home," Mr. Johnson said. "I remembered the cheesecake, too. What's for dinner?"
Mrs. Johnson came out of the kitchen and kissed him. She was a comfortable woman, and smiling as Mr. Johnson smiled. "Hard day?" she asked.
"Not very,"
said Mr. Johnson, hanging his coat in the closet.
"How about you?"
So, she said. She stood in the kitchen doorway while he settled into his easy chair and took off his good shoes and took out the paper he had bought this morning. "Here and there," she said.
"I didn't do too badly," Mr. Johnson said. "Couple young people."
"Fine," she said. "I had a little nap this afternoon. Took it easy most of the day. Went into a department store this morning and accused a woman next to me of shoplifting, and had the store detective pick her up. Sent 3 dogs to the pound. You know, the usual thing. Oh, and listen," she added, remembering.
"What?"
said Mr. Johnson. "Well," she said, "I got onto a bus and asked the driver for a transfer. And when he helped someone else first, I said he was impertinent and quarreled with him. And then I said why wasn't he in the army, and I said it loud enough for anyone to hear. And I took his number and turned in a complaint. Probably got him fired."
"Fine," said Mr. Johnson. "But you look tired. Want to change over tomorrow?"
"I would like to," she said. "I could do with a change."
"Right," said Mr. Johnson.
"What's for dinner?" "Veal cutlet."
"Had it for lunch,"
said Mr. Johnson. I hope that came out well and was interesting for you guys. Please let me know if you actually like this series. I was thinking I could bounce back and forth between Nate narrating and me. If you have any suggestions, also let me know. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you next time. It's been a treat.